Okay, I think we can begin, and hopefully other participants are not going to be tardy and, will join us very soon. Good evening, everybody. This is our second lecture in the In Translation lecture series that is now gone online. And we are actually very fortunate, ironically, that COVID-19 has come around and allowed us, one, to invite all of our wonderful guests who respond to the invitation with generosity, despite the distance, but also the fact that it has brought to our audience quite a varied and unexpected number of participants that we are really very happy to see, and we welcome you all, and I hope you will enjoy the lectures that we offer at the Center for Translation Studies. My name is Samia Mehriz, and I'm the director of the Center for Translation Studies, and I'd like to take a couple of moments to announce very briefly upcoming lectures at the center during the fall semester of this year. So on November 10th, we are expecting my colleague Catarina Bello, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the American University in Cairo, to be lecturing on translating medieval Islamic philosophy into Portuguese. So that's something that you may be on the lookout for. On December 8th, we have another lecture by my colleague, Dr. Faiza Heikel, Professor of Egyptology, who will be lecturing on translating ancient Egyptian culture and language, another fascinating topic. And we're very happy to be able to host both colleagues within the series. This evening's lecture is of particular importance, and it could not be more timely, actually. It also comes in the wake of the publication by Routledge of an impressive anthology, the Handbook on Translation and Activism, that is co-edited by our guest speakers, Rebecca Ruth Gould and Kayvan Tahmasebian. Their volume on translation and activism provides us actually with a staggering number of much needed and in many instances underrepresented voices, perspectives, and trajectories that question, unsettle, and reassess the interrelated and largely uncharted connections between translation and activism in a globalized world. So this is indeed a most welcome addition to the repertoire that already exists in translation studies. Rebecca Ruth Gould is Professor of Islamic World and Comparative Literature at the University of Birmingham. Her work broadly traverses literary, political, and legal theory. She is the author of the award-winning monograph, Writers and Rebels, The Literatures of Insurgency in the Caucasus, that was published in 2016, which won the University of Southern California Book Prize in Literary and Cultural Studies and the Best Book of the Year award from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. She is also author of the Persian prison poem, Sovereignty and the Political Imagination, which is forthcoming in 2021. She has also translated many books from Persian and Georgian, including After Tomorrow, The Days Disappear, published in 2016, and with Kayvan Tahmasebian, High Tide of the Eyes, which was published in 2019. Kayvan Tahmasebian is a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Birmingham and principal investigator of Transmodern, a Horizon 2020 funded project on the position of translated literature within modern Iranian literary theory. He is a poet, a critic, and the author of Isfahan's Mold, which was published in 2016, Lecture on Fear and Other Poems, that was published in 2019, and co-translator with Rebecca of High Tide of the Eyes, Poems by Bijan Ilahi, published in 2019. His work has also appeared in several journals, including Wasafari, Modernism, Modernity, 20th Century Literature, and the Kenyan Review. Before I give the floor to our distinguished guests, I would like to read the opening sentence from the introduction to the anthology, which I think speaks most intensely to the urgency of their project. So allow me to read for you from the introduction. When we were midway through editing this volume, we received a message from one of the contributors. She was headed to prison in less than 2 weeks and asked us to hurry with our edits, since she did not know whether she would have access to electronic communication from within her prison cell, or whether she would be released before the book was published. She therefore asked us to make any requests as soon as possible. Her situation represented in acute form the pressures under which many of us, translators, activists, and academics, concerned with the politics of language, labor. And I think this is very eloquently put and speaks volumes to what we are about to hear from both our speakers. So without further ado, please help me welcome Rebecca and Kayvan. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Samia. Thanks, Samia.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy I'm taking part in this amazing community, and I hope I can adhere to Borges's advice that don't unless you can improve the silence. So I take it as an opportunity for some kind of a speech activism, and thank you all for the time you kindly give to me. Let me start this PowerPoint that I have prepared for this presentation first. Okay. I think you can have the PowerPoint right now. Is everything okay? So I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah. For today, I try to give a snapshot of activist translation in the field of studies, in fact, then focus on 2 decisive moments of activist translation studies, that is 2 articles by Maria Timochkos and Mona Bakers, and then elaborate a little bit on the timeliness of activist translation that Rebecca and I highlighted in our introduction to our HTA. Okay, so to begin with, we can just imagine the field as an intersection of translation and activism, basically, or translation and political engagement, or translation and social change. Basically, we can approach it from at least two directions, from the direction of translation studies and from an activist point of view. The question of how is translation understood in this way is tied into the question what activism is, how it means to be a militant in the field of translation, a partisan, and with what goals. So the goal of the field, as you can see, is to understand the potential of translation for activism and political engagement. And according to Timochko, to whom we will return very soon, we need at least three things for theorizing an activist translation. First, the definition of power, what is going to be resisted or contested. Second, an adequate range of case studies. And third, theoretical concepts and practical methods. This gives us also a view of the strategies, tactics, and techniques of action, resistance, combat, and support. For example, we can ask as a translator activist, why I'm fighting, what I'm fighting for, how I'm fighting, and when and where, in these kind of questions. So it is to define the translator, I mean, in neo-activist roles, in neo-activist position. So it means just to imagine the translator as a defender, or as a striker, or as a supporter, and so on. So this is the field from above. At a closer inspection and from the side of translation studies, we can trace the trajectory of the theorizations of activist translation according to Timochko. So stemmed from DTS, descriptive translation studies, then noticing the power relations in the process of translation, then 90s cultural turn and the question of ideology, then colonial theories of translation, and trying to unravel the mechanisms of oppression and the movement towards colonization, decolonization. And then we will see an explosion in many diverse paths in the post 9/11 world of global demonstrations, general strike actions, riots, terrorism, civil disobedience, revolution, displacement, migration, and insurrection. So the field has already started to expand in interdisciplinary ways by joint research and field operation with studies in contentious politics and social movements. Here, as you can see, I have highlighted two significant moments of research on translation and activism, which I think also indicates the transformation of research paradigms, analytical concepts and methods from post-colonial studies to social movement studies. And the first one is Maria Timochko's article, Translation and Political Engagement, Activism, Social Change, and the Role of Translation in Geopolitical Shifts, the translator. And the second one is Mona Baker's Translation and Activism, Emerging Patterns of Narrative Community in the Massachusetts 2006. The first moment at the turn of the millennium, Maria Timochko's Translation and Political Engagement, which is published in Translator in 2000. And Timochko defines the activist translation as some kind of partiality or as being a partisan. So translator as partisan manipulates the original, according to her, to reach the intended effect. So the idea of activism is already tied for her into the translator's agency. So Activist translation is politically engaged, and engagement is defined in terms of taking part in a battle or conflict. And translation is activist when it participates in changing the existing power structures, which are supposed to represent discrimination and injustice. The case study Timoshko investigates is a classical model of post-colonial studies, the role of translation during and after the Irish independence through the transformation of the hero Cuchulainn. I'm not going into details of Timoshko's case study, but Timoshko's article inspired me to think of the matter of agency in new ways. For example, I was thinking about how Timoshko distinguishes between activist translation as a real action and translation, which is just showing an ethos or ideological orientation. So for Timoshko, activist translation is a speech act. It is translation that rouses, that induces communities to take action. So there must be some kind of impact expected. So your speech should have some kind of impact. This impact should be felt. And so cites Douglas Robinson's test of political effectiveness in this regard of a text as its capacity to reach mass audiences. In this way, I think activist translation helps to communicate an attitude to a wider audience. It is in this way that I think translation can participate in attitudinal shifts which are necessary for any political actions. However, this made me think a distinction to be made between politics and activism, which we will talk about right now in the next slide, and of course about the ways they join forces as this collocation of political activism. The distinction occurred to me when I was thinking about different ways of describing a social movement. I was thinking that this could be done from two perspectives. That is, from the vantage point of power, and I mean, this is where a sequence of protest actions, for example, is described by the state media as some kind of a riot, or is analyzed by them as a kind of security mismanagement. And from the point of view of resistance, B, or if you prefer, counteraction, of course, where the sequence of actions is seen from the angle of changing the power balance, the power structure, or changing a law that institutionalizes some form of discrimination and injustice. From this perspective, the long-term success of a movement is measured in terms of the goals the movement has realized. But this also means that the activist movement has already institutionalized itself. The danger in that moment is being ignorant or blind to other forms of discrimination and injustices that still exist. I'm talking about a radical activism that is capable of transforming itself in innumerable diverse ways to act against innumerable forms of oppression. This also for me indicates two different modes of existence for an activist cause, or two moments. I mean the moment of mobilization and the moment of stabilization. Second moment, the social movement has become institutionalized and acquired a certain degree of conservatism. A concrete example of this for me is when I see how post-colonial theories, which disclose the mechanisms of mental colonization and suggest ways toward decolonization, are themselves used or or perhaps rather misused in some time and places as a means of justifying domestic oppression. So this means sheer politics to me, which is a matter of taking sides and not progression toward eradication of any form of oppression or discrimination and servitude. Since that the truth content that once motivated the activist cause is now reduced to a simple matter of allegiance and belonging to an identity category. Because the oppressed world mostly suffers from this complicity between some kind of a colonialism as well as corrupt oppression at home, not seeing one of these wings is I think, some kind of a short-sightedness, critical short-sightedness and critical distraction. Of course, unethical at any price. Then let's go to Mona Baker's Translation and Activism, published in 2006. With Mona Baker's Translation and Activism, Emerging Patterns of Narrative Community, published in 2006, we see the power structures and mechanisms and resistance to these structures of narrative theory. So we say that power generates narratives. It is exerted through narratives and their propagators and their guardians. And resistance means to create alternative narratives, or as Timoshko cites from Edward Said, alternative structures of feeling. So narratives also offer something around which a community can be formed. So in a community, you have to believe in the narrative because it defines a role for you, or it gives some kind of identity to you. So I mean the identity you acquire through belonging to a community. So for Baker, translational activism is taking part in some kind of a battle of narratives. And competing narratives in this theory are in conflict, and activist translation aims to challenge the dominant institutionalized master narratives. So Baker's case studies include groups of translators that are mostly volunteers, so aid humanitarian and activist causes, such as Traditori per la Pace, Translators Without Borders, and Babels, and so on. And she proposes that a narrative analysis of activist translation can focus on two types of questions. First, the questions of the type of narratives these groups elaborate, asking how they mediate those narratives, both in terms of the selection of the material to be translated and the specific modes of translation adopted. And second, another line of inquiry informed by narrative theory examines the activist translation community's own narratives for coherence and fidelity. By consistency and fidelity, by consistency, Baker means hanging together of the parts of that story. And by fidelity, she intends testing the story in terms of its causes and the values it promotes. Okay, let's return to Maria Timoshko before I quickly move to a brief discussion of RHTA. Timoshko has suggested that in order to understand the potential of translation for activism and political engagement, we need at least three things. One, a theoretical approach to power. Two, adequate range of case studies. And three, theoretical concepts and practical methods to describe what makes a specific examples effective. When Rebecca and I were shaping our HTA in collaboration with our amazing contributors, we tried to include a really geographically and temporally diverse range of case studies. For us, I think this variety created new networks of international solidarity, which was established between, for example, Irish women's rights movements and Muslim women's rights activists and Taiwanese students movement, demonstrators or Dalit writers and Syrian and Palestinian, Iranian professors, just to name a few. And how these networks can learn from and enrich each other's experiences. And as it's clear from the title of our introduction to the volume, Translation and the time of the now, we were drawn to the matter of timeliness of the change. Okay, or translation and activism at the time of now. Okay, let's think about translational activism in terms as we intended to think about it. So, oppression and resistance in temporal terms. To begin with, we can say that activism always happens at the time of the now. So for a social movement to be successful, of course, a good sense of timing is necessary. But this timing does not merely refer to the chronological actions that should be taken during the protest movement, for example. Rather, I want to refer to a chirological aspect of the social movement or an activist campaign, as opposed to chronos, which represents the linear time. I can define kairos as the conception of time as opportune moment in Greek terms, or the fleeting moments that should be seized. As an example, just imagine, for example, translator like the Iranian writer Ali Shariati, who decides to translate Franz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth into Persian for the revolutionary atmosphere of the 1970s Iran. So this translation ties the experience of colonialism in Algeria to the political oppression under political system in Iran, who is believed to be an accomplice to colonial superpower. So in this sense, 1960s Algeria is tied into 1970s Iran. So this is the comparative aspect of activist translation. So I tend to call it the metonymic function of activist translation, as you see in this PowerPoint, translation and metonymic temporalities. This metonymic temporality, I mean activist translation is able to configure history through creating metonymic associations across different times and of course different places. Therefore, we can say that the activist translation refers to a lack or a gap in the existing situation. The word situation is very important for me because one of the reasons Rebecca and I translated Mehrotra Farhodpour's article, Thought Translation for RHTA for the first time into English, was its theoretical involvement with the situationism of activist translation. There is a gap, in the socialist structure, and there is this text, this certain text, which can contribute to bridging the gap. So if an axis of fidelity can be characterized, can be defined for activist translation, it is the fidelity to this very situation, which affects not only what the translator selects to translate at certain socio-historical conditions, but also adopting certain methods to render those texts. So for this purpose, the activist translator would think how to exert most assured impact on the intended audience, how to move people or the policymakers to do something or refrain from doing something. So if the activist translation is to be evaluated, it is in terms of the role it plays for bridging for bridging this gap, for bringing about a social change that okay, let's let's finish it. It is not in terms of, for example, classical word for word or sense for sense measures. I mean that an activist translation is to be assessed on a practical level. This, I think, leads us again to the distinction between politics and activism that I talked about earlier. I now tend to reformulate the difference between politics and activism in the functions of affecting minds in politics and affecting deeds in activism. So politics would become just a matter of allegiance, just a matter of just a declaration of fidelity. But we know that declaration of fidelity is not enough for activism. So I think this difference between political engagement and social activism should be emphasized in order to make us conscious about the danger of activist causes degrading into inane games of position taking or political lobbying, for example. Now, let's try to give some kind of examples about this idea of activism as a battle of temporalities and this presentation. The very fact that certain works have to be read at certain times because reading certain texts makes certain impacts at certain times shows that power is to a great extent involved with manipulating the occurrence of the event. So we can say that power delays the intended impact. Power is what separates idea from action. Therefore, power is also the power to delay, the power to manage time. So censorship, for example, serves such a function. Works should be read at certain times to have intended effect, and sooner and later than that point or those points of time, the work would impact in other ways, we can say, if we are not saying that it loses its impact. So censorship is already a temporalist structure because it manipulates the realization of text at certain times by slowing down their public diffusion. Or we can say accelerating the publication of other texts in order to strengthen some dominant narratives. So Pinlin Chang's contribution to RHTA, for example, showed the ways in which translators bypassed these temporal effects of censorship during Taiwan's Sunflower Student Movement by providing real-time translations of participants' messages in social media. And this can be seen also in the state's policy making with regard to the social memories or collective memories too, what can be called social memory surgery or social memory engineering, as you can see here too. By this, I mean any kind of manipulations in the collective memory of a community. And by this, I mean that power decides what you remember and what you forget. So part of the state's institutionalized cultural heritage activities in some states or in all the states work toward preservation of events and certain historical sites and the collective forgetting of certain sites and dates. So activism can be defined as some kind of battle of memories, I think, in some sense. The activist translator is the one who intervenes in this sense in the temporal manipulations of the power structures. Just let us look at the map of a city to give you an example from the eyes of a protester. So it turns into a I mean, the city, the map of the city for a protester turns into a cartographic elements are categorized into places of hiding, gathering, scattering, and escaping from security forces. Just in the same way, I think that a translator activist, an activist translator, aims at recognizing the translational sensitivities of a power system. I think I have, I should interrupt here because I have spoken too much. So I will give you a list of further reading that are important. I think are some essential readings. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks, Cairo. Thanks, American University in Cairo. And thanks, Samia, Iman, everyone who helped us organize this fantastic event. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kayvan. So I will pick up where Kayvan left off. And I think there are some interesting intersections between what we have to say, even though we didn't precisely compare notes. Yeah, so I'm going to, I also will read a little bit, giving some background to the book itself. And I should show that it's been mentioned many times. Here's the cover, a big, very big, thick book. So sort of introducing, talking about the genesis of that and editing that. And then I'll also move into a PowerPoint a few minutes after that. So just to kind of reflect a little bit in very broad terms about what is translational activism. I want to start by saying a few things about it. And so the first thing I think that should be said about translational activism is that every translator is an activist. A translator is by definition someone who has chosen to become an advocate for a specific text from a specific language and a specific cultural context, and to intervene in the contemporary moment in such a way as to make a space for a new and foreign aesthetic creation. So that is, every translator does that. You can't translate if that's not your goal. And that is activism at a certain level. I can dwell on that a little bit more though. So it's worth noting in this particular juncture, this time now, that activism is being used in negative ways by certain groups and governments. For very recently, for example, we have judicial activism in the United States. We have activist lawyers in the UK. So it's not always a positive term. But I'm guessing that for this particular audience, it is a positive thing. So it's worth kind of registering that divergence of views around what is activism. One standard definition holds that activism encompasses all collective efforts to change power relations at all levels, from the interpersonal to the international. That's a sort of a generic social science definition of activism. Viewing this definition through the prism of translation studies, we can be more specific. We can say that translational activism builds on the fact that language is always collective. And this is what makes all translation activist. So in other words, it's the activist dimension of translation begins simply with the medium itself. That language is a collective medium. So with that said, a premise, I think, of any inquiry into this subject should be that all translators are activists in the sense that they're advocates. However, with that said, it is still worth trying to make translation more reflexively and deliberately activist, and thereby to increase its effectiveness. And that's one goal of this volume, to give a kind of systematic overview of what translational activism is, to begin to formulate the principles for this consciousness raising, and at the same time equipping us to better evaluate the role of activism in translation, and to develop new pathways for future activist agendas. So to do that, we have to think about, as broadly as possible, about what constitutes translation and about what constitutes activism. We had to think beyond familiar geographies, familiar temporalities, and beyond the issues that we were most at home with. We also, of course, had to be open to what our contributors offered us and to be willing to revise our preconceptions of what translational activism is. And of course, that changed over the course of our work on this project, which spanned a few years. So a few convictions underwrote our project, and others emerged on the basis of the material that we faced. The first and most important principle for this project was that we did not want our contributors to be drawn exclusively from the ranks of academics. Activism that is completely, now I suppose I'm just speaking here for myself, although there's a lot of convergence in other areas with Kayvan, activism that is completely confined to the university context is not activism at all. At the same time, a volume that aims to develop a better and more systematic account of the intersections of translation and activism will necessarily be analytical. So the question of situating translation's activist tendencies within a scholarly tradition can only increase and strengthen that agenda. So just as we did not want this to be a volume to be limited to academics, we also recognize the importance of the contribution that an academic approach would make. And so we aimed for a symbiosis, and we invited poets, non-affiliated critics, and writers of many different backgrounds to contribute alongside established and early career academics. So that's the first basic principle of the editing and organization of the volume, is that translational activism in general, I would sort of generalize this to a statement about translational activism, that it should always look beyond the academy, but it should also recognize the strengths that come from having a relationship to the academy, because it is most often, for better or worse, in university context, knowledge is given systematic form and institutional support. And so one very obvious example of that would be this seminar right now taking place at this moment, right? It's taking place through a university with the support of a university, with, in other words, in an institutional context and with the material infrastructure that comes with it. And of course, so there are pluses and minuses to that. The second conviction that developed, the more work in the volume, is that we had to think creatively about, this is exactly, I think, intersecting very closely with Kayvan's words. We had to, so it says that the host muted me, but hopefully I'm, okay, good. I can be heard now. Sorry. So yes, so now I'm turning. So that the first principle I wanted to really emphasize was that whole. It's a kind of difficult question. What is the relationship of translational activism to the academy, given that much reflection, theoretical reflection, certainly on translation, takes place in the academy. And the second question now turning to is the temporality of activism. So, and our keystone or lodestar for this inquiry was Walter Benjamin's insight into the temporality of political existence. So I will read right now one paragraph from the introduction of the RHTA, Routledge Handbook of Translation and Activism, that summarizes this point. Activist translation takes place in what Walter Benjamin calls Jetztzeit, the time of the now, on the concept of history. For Benjamin, the moment of now contains the possibility of revolution, in contrast to the ruling classes' homogeneous empty time. Through their translations, activist translators intervene to redeem time and its revolutionary discontinuity, thereby contributing to a history of the oppressed, a history that must be written in the future tense. Benjamin identifies a secret agreement between past and present generations. The past exists not only to give us lessons, but also so that activists can bring to fruition in the present what past generations failed to achieve in the past. Continuities across time make such fulfillment possible. So the point here is that the past matters for translational activism. It is not incidental to it, even when that activism is future oriented. Language, and here I am echoing unintentionally, Kayvan, language is above all a repository of memories, or as Benjamin would say, a document of barbarisms. And translators are its guardians and interpreters for future generations. For this reason, many of the contributions in the volume are profoundly engaged with documenting pasts, and often pre-colonial pasts in Africa, the Levant, South Asia, and beyond. Had we had the opportunity, we would have liked to go even deeper into the past, for example, to look at translational activism and antiquity, but that has to be for another time. So now I'm moving to the PowerPoint part of what I want to say. So I'm going to share my screen and, good. Hope that works. Share. Okay, so everyone can see that? Kayvan, not okay. Okay, let me know, Kayvan, if there are any problems, please.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah,
we can see
I
it.
can see them. Yeah.
I'm going to turn it into a slideshow. Just give me a second. There we go. Play from start. Okay. Yes. So right. So, and I can only see part of the screen, but I'm assuming it's all visible to everyone. Great. So I just want to, as briefly as I possibly can, walk you through the kind of overall structure of the volume. I'm not going to. There are 31 chapters, so can't describe them. In fact, I won't name the authors because that would just take up too much time. But I can briefly say that it's divided into 8 parts. And so the first part is theorizing translation and activism. So we have a theoretical framework set up at the beginning. We begin with Gramsci, a chapter on Gramsci, in the series of edits and translations that his notebooks were subjected to. Then looking at Judith Butler, how she translated into an Italian context. And as Kayvan mentioned, our translation of Murad Fahadpour is here in the theorizing section. And then there's Marx in Japan. So the reception of Marx in Japan by Yoshimoto Takakaki, a very tense time in Japanese history. And after that sort of theoretical prolegomena, we look at translational activism in oral context. So that's what's meant here by interpreter, the interpreter's activist. And that section has chapters on the pre-modern figure of what we would now call a translator, someone who mediates in the pre-colonial African court. In oral context, works as an interpreter, and then how fixers or translators worked as go-betweens among different communities in Mandate Palestine, and interpretation and oral translation in the Gaza Strip. And then we moved to the textual side of translation as activism, but text in the very broad sense of the term. So not just text on paper. So for example, there's a chapter on graffiti on the walls of Aleppo during the war, the recent war, and how these were mediated and interpreted. And then chapter of Paul Bowles' translations of oral stories in Tangier. Then we look at how Iranian translators engaged with government enterprises, and how Le Monde was translated into Spanish. And then we move to a section that really, I think, embodies the idea of not being confined to the academy. So it's the section on bearing witness, which contains contributions by poets and activists, not just academics. And there's a chapter there that was alluded to by Samia, where the Turkish author, was describing her autobiography, and she was facing a prison sentence right as she completed the chapter. So it's a really wonderful chapter I recommend everyone read. And then there's a contribution by a Palestinian poet who describes moving in between Arabic and English. There's a chapter, again, prison is a kind of recurrent theme, unsurprisingly, on Moroccan prison writings, specifically the prefaces and co-authorship by translators. And finally, testimonies in the Latin American context. And then we move on to sort of shifting the disciplinary focus, translation and human rights. So especially looking at translation in legal context and how that intersects with activism. There are chapters on the role of the Irish language and how criminals have, according to Irish law, have the right to have the proceedings take place in their native language. Chapters on immigrants in the United States who have limited English and access to the courts, and how Islamic feminism is translated into international human rights law. The next section is called Translating the Vernacular. So that's, as you can imagine, looking at multilingualism and in societies where it's not, monolingualism is not a norm, such as Africa, and in India, of course, and in the Dalit context in particular. And then the seventh section, again, turning to refugees, migration, which is another recurrent theme of the volume. There's a chapter looking at the concept of asylum among Spanish, Latin, Mexican, Central American refugees in America and in the Sahrawi desert, and foodways among migrants. And the final chapter, again, sort of, as one might expect, there's a whole section on a translation and revolution. So looking at revolutionaries and how translation plays into that in the 19th century Chinese context, among Lu Xun, the Chinese writer, and in Iran, of course, right after the revolution of 1979, in Taiwan Sunflower Movement, and an afterward by Paul Bandia. So that's obviously a very, it's a very thick, dense volume, and at the same time, there are lots of things that we still could have added, you know, that are not included, and I'll be talking about some of those as well. Let me see. So I want to make sure I could. Yes. Okay. So out of those, all of that density of case studies and material, we identified 4 basic modalities of the translator activist. And of course, this isn't intended to be comprehensive. It's only a commentary on the material that we were working with. But certainly those 31 chapters, 31 case studies yielded what seems like four paradigms, one being the witness bearer, so a translator whose role is a kind of to document, to record a testimony, and that often converges with the role of autobiography. And then the translator activist as interpreter, who puts the perspectives and experiences of oppressed and silent peoples into words. And of course, there's overlap between these roles often. The translator as mediator is another paradigm. So often in very multilingual contexts of say, South Asia and Africa, for example, the translator is someone who mediates among many different languages that have stark differentials in terms of power. So, you know, an imperial language versus a colonized language and so forth. And then the translator as revolutionary on the barricades, coming to terms with the aftermath of revolution. And again, this is an area that could be expanded quite extensively, but I just wanted to introduce 3 activist translational methods, because I think people are often interested, especially practicing translators, in how they can sharpen the activist dimension of their work, or how they may already be sort of activists without articulating that activism. So one of my first example is drawn directly from the book itself. It refers to a chapter in the book, and the other 2 examples are not. They refer to materials that I've come across in other contexts that could have been in a book, or maybe will be in another book, but weren't in this particular volume. So just to begin with the chapter, the example that comes directly from the book, and just to walk you through those 3 modes of translational activism, which again are not at all comprehensive. These are just examples. So paratext, visual images, notes, commentaries are various ways in which a translation can kind of sharpen its activist potential and its activist dimensions. And then the second one, I think, is probably quite obvious, but maybe it's something that it's kind of the foundation for the claim that every translation is an activist translation, every translator is an activist translator. So that just by selecting a text in relationship to a specific target audience, that's already a kind of activism. And the third method or approach, you get very specific, granular at the level of language, is pronouns. So I'll sort of go and look a little bit more in depth briefly at those 3 examples. Translation, commentary, and paratext. So this example is taken from chapter 22 of the RHTA volume. It's called The Dialectics of Dissent in Post-Colonial India. And I should mention that I'm here in this discussion drawing on draft material, because actually, and this is a bonus of listening to this lecture, the images I'm showing were not included in the volume due to permissions, inability of getting permissions. So it's just a text-based analysis in the published version. But the images were quite extraordinary, and they change the way we might want to look at the text. So as you can see, this is the image here. So the chapter, I should say, refers to a magazine, artist periodical. Here I'm quoting from the author, Hushmi Mehta. Vrishik was a artist periodical published in Baroda, India, between 1969 and 1973, co-edited by the artists Gul Muhammad Sheikh and Bhupin Kahar. These it was a trilingual publication with writings published in Hindi, Gujarati, and English. So translation was really at the heart of its enterprise. And there's a quote there. So from the magazine, the 1970 edition, we need more powerful words. We need more than powerful words to describe the world we live in. So is an art historian, as well as someone who's interested in translation studies. So I think that the visual element there, it's an artist collective, as was just noted, but it's an artist collective that's comprised of visual artists and poets and translators. So this image was created to accompany a poem by Cesare Pavese, the Italian poet. And I think it's an example, again, I'm just going to breeze through these things very quickly, because of course you can read the chapter and learn more. But just as a kind of very brief reflection on what one might say about this from a translational activist perspective, well, this is a modernist Indian publication that arguably is kind of taking a relatively contemporary Italian text and making it strange through these images, and that's the way in which the proximate European text is introduced to an Indian audience. So it's creating a kind of common modernism, but through estrangement. That's at least what I see this image achieving. And here's another very interesting example of a paratext, the way a paratext shapes the way in which a translation is read. And in this case, it's an example of making a very old text, a text by the Indian poet Kabir, who's from the 15th century, making it very new and making it very contemporary. So this is by a translation by a well-known Indian poet, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. And as you can see from the text itself, the way it reads in English, the other's wife is a knife, do not embrace her limbs. It has a very contemporary feel. And often, if you read a 15th century work in the 20th century, it's not going to have that kind of contemporary feel. So this is what I think of when I think of an activist translation, something that brings the past to life. And in this case, also it's important in the sense of being a kind of pre-colonial past that was suppressed by colonialism. And I think the image also adds to that effect, right? So it's a very, it makes the distant contemporary. So that's just one example of paratext. And of course, the same effect is achieved through introductions, notes, and the chapters in the volume explore that effect as well. So this is shifting gears quite a bit, but I did want to give a broad perspective. And this is something we don't have a chapter on this individual, Dara Shikoh, but I think he deserves mention, especially in line with our discussion of temporality. He deserves mention in any discussion of translational activism. So he was a Indian prince, Mughal prince, who is known for heterodox views and interest in non-Muslim religions. And so I'm using him just very briefly to illustrate the idea that just by choosing a text to translate, that is an activist endeavor. So the text that he chose to translate was the Upanishads, the Hindu scripture, which he translated into Persian for the first time. And that translation served as a kind of foundation for his own original work. One example is the Majmu al-Bahrain, the confluences of the two seas, which harmonizes Sufi philosophy and Vedanta philosophy and Hinduism. Now, of course, that had been done before in the Mughal context, but I think in his particular milieu that he was based in, his translational choices put him somewhat in the margins of not to say that there weren't any precedents in India, but it created problems for him. Let's put it that way. And ultimately, it made him less on the margins of the court politics. And he was ultimately killed by his brother Aurangzeb. I'm not claiming as a direct result of his translations, but just that his embrace of non-Muslim views as a Muslim ruler, as a potential Muslim ruler, because he could have been an heir to the throne. He lost the battle, was killed by his brother, had implications for his life, and it was an activist decision, an activist choice. And then this is again shifting gears quite a bit. A third example of a methodology of translational activism, and it ties into another project that I'm embarked on called. That's why I have a ERC logo, and the Twitter feed for the project is also on the upper right-hand corner of the screen, called Global Literary Theory. And this is a project that compares pre-modern Persian, Turkic, and Arabic rhetorical theories of balagha by translating some of the key treatises into English. And it's not obviously not, it's I'm working with a team of colleagues and scholars who are specialists in these respective literatures. And as you might imagine, one of the recurrent issues in translation of texts that are poetry or about poetry, text of poetics, is the question of translating pronouns. And of course, I'm sure in your own languages, as an audience, you will, every language treats gender differently from a grammatical perspective, right? Some languages have very elaborate schemes for representing gender. Some have a third person neuter. Some don't have anything like that at all. And then there are languages that don't have gender in the third person. So the implication of that is that you would not know grammatically whether the beloved is male or female. And that, to take this further, has implications for contemporary debates around gender identity, around pronoun usage. I think it's often underestimated what the contribution of, say, a language like Persian might be to English when we debate about what pronouns to apply to people, as if there's only one way of thinking about that, the English way. And I, just to kind of borrow a quote from a discussion about translational activism that I heard recently, I'll give you the reference at the end. There's a translator named Jen Hoffer who was thinking about how the problem of translating pronouns can be used to advance an activist agenda. She said trans existence, in the sense of non-binary gender existence, can inform translational activism. So when we recognize that gender is not a grammatically universal, and we recognize that our role of translators is in fact to intervene into the target language, then there's some potentials are revealing. And one might say, well, this is 12th century medieval poetics. What does that have to do with debates? But I believe it does. And it does it in a very practical sense when we're translating various rhetorical treatises that in Persian don't use gender, and in Arabic, for example, gender is heavily marked. So the strategy we've been developing as a team is to try to use neutral third persons pronouns, as Persian gives us a model for doing that whenever possible. So those are three kind of methodologies for ways in which translational activism is manifested in the practice of translation. And I'm going to end by just introducing some kind of collectives that are embarked in this translational activist work, and which I admire and would recommend to you to explore further. So 3 websites. One is called Antena Arabe. It's a collective that is focused somewhat on the Spanish communities, but they have resources for everyone around the world. There's a mailing list. You can go to their website. They have lots of resources that can be downloaded in different languages, reflecting on translational activism and how to link with your communities and help people. One term that they focus on, or one particular situation, is linguicide. So individuals who are disadvantaged because their linguicism, because of their particular linguistic situation, and how translators can help people in those situations and bring justice to the practice of language. And then there's another very international collective called Tlaxcala. that is actively looking for translators to become involved. They have a very well-resourced website with lots of resources translated into many different languages, profiles of different translators. And again, I would encourage you to look at their website. And then there's a new journal as well called Barricade Journal that's affiliated, or it's based in New York, somewhat affiliated with New York University, I believe. And they are specifically focused on the role of translation in anti-fascism and activism. And we recently did an interview, Kayvan and I, about the RHTA volume that you can read there. And there's also a review of the book. So you could, and they're always looking for contributors and translators. So if you feel inclined, submit your work there. And I'm just going to end with 3 resources. Again, I referenced this video a few minutes ago at Activist Translation with, again, a very practical focused perspective and how different translators approach activism in their work. And the website I referenced earlier, the Antenna, also has some very useful, inspiring, one might say, pamphlets that you can download. And then finally, our book. And I just wanted to mention the question of sort of the price tag attached to it and how we might access it nonetheless. Of course, it's a very expensive book. We know that, we recognize that, we're not happy about that. But it's also worth noting that it's accessible, digitally. Institutions with subscriptions to Taylor and Francis can, and I think the website is on the slide, can easily get PDFs or of the volume. The ebook itself is around $40, so it's expensive, but not as much as the hardback. So there are ways to access it. And I think those are my remarks. So let me see if I can stop sharing the screen. And let's see, are we back to normal? Great, okay. And so I think those are our presentations, and Kayvan and I were going to, well, we could do the break. We have 2 questions to ask each other, but should we just break and then begin with that?
Okay, well, first let me thank you both for a very rich presentation of the volume, which is colossal, really, in its its inclusiveness. And yes, as we had agreed before we started, we would like to break for 15 minutes and allow for participants to actually put their questions in writing to the guest speakers. I will also be looking at them myself, and we will try to sort of eliminate redundancy and regroup questions so that they can address them, as they please between them. But yes, so in order to do this, we will take 15 minutes break. Please don't leave the meeting. Stay with us, keep yourselves muted, and just note your questions so that the participants, well, I mean, the speakers can actually see them, and so can I, and we can make a collective decision on, how to best address most of them. Thank you again. I have my own questions. I will save them for later. And so let's reconvene. We're not leaving. Just keep your mics off and your cameras off. And in 15 minutes, we'll be back to answer questions. Sure. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
And begin with a very general question that is, has been gnawing at me since I received this massive volume, that I think is a brilliant piece of work and a tremendous lot of effort and energy, and is in and of itself, an act of activism, really. And my question to you, therefore, is, how did you amass this volume of writings? I've had to do something similar, but it was much easier because I was putting together a volume that was based on lectures delivered at the center. So I already had a basis on which to build. a very large volume. But I want you to, I'm interested in this process. How did you bring together all of these people, and as you described, come from very different venues, academics, activists, poets, people in government, I mean, writing about the present, the past, etc. That's one question. The other question, because that's something also that I reflect on, given that, that we had a volume written by our students on Egypt's revolution, translating Egypt's revolution, and what Kayvan said about the battle of memories, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you produce something like this, and and then what? In this process of battles over memories, right? I remember one of the contributors to that volume, Translating Egypt's Revolution, saying after the fact, this has become an artifact of the revolution, that it loses or has lost, its immediacy, its urgency, the fervor with which, the passion, and therefore the impact, right, that you talked about. So these are my two very general questions about your work.
I could answer the first. Would you want to take the second, Kayvan? Is that good? Okay.
Sure. That's fine.
Okay. So as to how we went about gathering these contributors, well, so initially it was just me, and it was sort of a word of mouth arrangement. But I think once, so there are many different stages. As I said, this went over this process of gathering contributors extended over a few years, and I'm sort of looking to jog my memory, looking at each contributor. I mean, I just did a lot of research in what was sort of students were working on, what PhDs were being completed, and some of the best contributors were the ones that were sort of randomly discovered, random places. And I did have to chase a lot of people down. There's, I won't give specific names, I guess, but lot of detective work. Certainly, there are some elements of that. But people were generous, and I do think this is the time, in a sense. It's interesting that a volume like this, to my knowledge at least, has not been produced, because there is something, I think, about this particular subject that people feel is necessary. A lot of just translation is sort of moving in that direction. Maybe it's just translation is becoming more important or something like that. But I found that people were very, very receptive to sharing other names, other ideas. So it wasn't that hard to get people to contribute. Once Kayvan certainly was very helpful on the Iranian side. So like a philosopher like Murad Farhadpour, who I wasn't familiar with, was brought on because of Kayvan, and I think a lot of the specific Middle Eastern focus Kayvan was helpful in that. But I made sure to circulate it as well to, so it's a combination of sort of people I knew, and friends of friends, contacts of contacts, and just soliciting from various disciplinary organizations. So I did reach out to law. I was very important to include law in the framework, as well as history, refugees. Yeah, so I think Kayvan?
Yeah. Okay. As for the second question about this battle of memories and then what? Okay. Yeah, that's a very good. That's a very good question, because I'm not sure about then what. Okay, because I don't see that. I don't think that there could be some kind of direct consequence of any activist intervention in the social change. I mean, we cannot accept such a thing that happened directly and immediately after some kind of activist agenda has been implemented. But I'm thinking about this battle of memories mostly in terms of tactics. By tactics, I mean that this should be some kind of some kind of plan of action for you, just to resist against forgetfulness that is imposed from the power structures. So this is part of the tactics. It means that it should lead a set of other actions instead of, for example, seeing it as an action in itself, and to expect that it would lead. I mean, for example, just trying to resist against such forgetfulness and trying to reawaken the memory of some disaster or some human suffering, or just to reenacting that disastrous memory have some kind of a direct consequence toward improving the social justice in a local or in a global context. But I think, yeah, this is part of this activist intervention. Should be some kind of a resistance against what I can call some kind of social memory manipulation, social memory surgery, or social memory engineering that is funded and for many corrupt states. Okay, so we can see that very, I mean, clearly in the mechanisms of the power, how they try to veil some kind of memory while give some kind of vivacity to other forms of memories. Yeah.
Okay, do you want me, I don't know if you've had time to look at the questions or if you would like me to, I'm happy to do that. One question is again for you, Kayvan. And the question, can you please elaborate on how censorship and rate, speed, time of publication of a specific text relates to politics and power relations?
Yeah, as I put out during my PowerPoint presentation, I tended to see the censorship as some kind of temporal structure. It was completely based on my own experience as a writer. I could see that, for example, as a writer, I would like my work at a certain time. So, for example, in the year 2012, I wanted my work to be read, okay, because I felt that the impact that I wanted is acquired through that certain socio-historical conditions in which I was with regard to the social field that I could see. It had its impacts then. But what does censorship does is just to create some kind of a delay effect. As I told you, it just creates a separation between idea and action. Because if ideas are transferred into actions immediately, it is something that perhaps falls outside of control. It is something that is considered as not manageable by the state, for example. So slowing down the creative process is very important in some power structures. And this is the function of censorship, okay? So just creating a distance or a gap, a temporal gap between the realization of the text, I say, that the text is realized when it's read by its intended audience, for example, in its own time and its own place. I don't say that there is a unique time and place for that. I don't say that. But there are times and places in which a text can be reactivated for activists, for activist agendas, I think. So, and this is what censorship does. It creates delays. And this is what power does. Okay? Yeah. I think I have answered it correctly. Better just.
That intersects very well with another question that I I wanted to address, and then also to have Kayvan address. At the end of, sorry, where to go? What is a power? Wait, where's the question? What is a theory? What could be the perspective of a theoretical approach to power when it comes to translation and activism? I think Kayvan has an answer to this, but I'll also try to see what I have to say about that. It's a very interesting question, actually. And I don't have any refined answer, but I would just say briefly, I think the answer has something to do with institutional structures that I was trying to gesture towards earlier. And I would also refer to the chapter in the Routledge Handbook by Kobus Murray on, it's called Okoyeme Poma, Exploring the Multi-Modality of Translation in Pre-Colonial African Context, as far as the question of power goes, because what's so interesting about the chapter is that it's an example of someone who's kind of a court fixture, who is, we could call him a translator, even if that's not precisely the word that's used in the African context. So he's a fixture of the court, very close to the king. The king needs him because the king doesn't know all of the languages that need to be known in order to govern the state. And so the translator, I would also kind of align this figure with poets in general and how they functioned, and especially in pre-modern times. The translator has knowledge that the rulers, that those in power need in order to be efficacious, in order to govern. And the translator also needs support from the ruler, from power. They need an institutional infrastructure, institutional backing. But there's also, but the very fact that the ruler doesn't have that power, doesn't have that knowledge, in many contexts, is certainly in the chapter that I just referenced, gives the the translator a kind of different power, subversive power. So so that's not a very fully fleshed out answer, but I do think it's a very interesting question. I think there is a kind of special power of translational activism that mediates maybe between institutions, but is not wholly of an institution. And I think Kayvan had some thoughts about, related to this, about the difference or the relationship between activism and politics. Did I get that right? Yes.
Yeah, between the political and the activist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you
elaborate? I was thinking about them. So perhaps it is very important just to see them as some kind of, I mean, to see the difference between them, as politics has to do, for me, okay, this is very crude, okay, but politics in this distinction means for me some kind of trying to impact the minds. It is just a question of allegiance for me. And on the other hand, there is this activism which deals with the act instead of it requires some kind of act, you know. So I was thinking about that, this distinction between politics and activism is somewhat comparable to the distinction between the realm of the deeds and the real realm of the sayings or opinions. They are not mere opinions, or they are not merely ideological orientations. Okay, we are not thinking about them. So perhaps a translator has some kind of certain ideological orientations, but he is not performing, or he is not believing himself just to be an activist. So I was just thinking about this distinction between political and activism. Sometimes I thought that perhaps political activism, is it already a redundancy, or they are talking about two different things? Politics is something and activism is something else.
Mm-hmm. I think the follow-up question also is quite interesting. I'd like to know Kayvan's response. I mean, it's could Bijan Elahi be an activist? If yes, I would be able to say how.
I don't think, I am not an expert in the biography, so. And I cannot know about the intentions of the person of Bijan al-Lahi. So I don't think, but I okay, so this relates to another question here.
Oh, should we just clarify?
Yeah, okay, I will answer.
Bijan al-Lahi is, sorry, the audience won't know. So Bijan al-Lahi, is it
Bijan al-Lahi, yeah, is a modernist poet, the forerunner in some kind of avant-gardism in modernist Iranian poetry. Yeah.
And it's also relevant to say that he did not publish his work, correct?
Yeah, and he and of course he had,
because during the revolution, after the revolution,
no political engagement you can find. Okay, so this is some kind of a political disengagement. Okay, when you're thinking about Bijan al-Lahi, perhaps, okay, that is why this question is important, I think. Okay, yes, Bijan al-Lahi in cases can be some kind of epitome of political disengagement. Okay, but
political disengagement. Mm-hmm.
Sorry?
I was just repeating the word, political disengagement.
Yes, but and I cannot say that if he had such and such political motivations or not. Okay, I'm not an expert in that. But as regards to the other question here that asks, would you please give us examples of texts for activist translation? I just want to combine these two questions. I just want to say that no text is inherently activist, or no translation is inherently activist. So I think that this activism is injected to certain texts by themselves. So perhaps we can imagine someday that this politically disengagement text of Bijan al-Lahi is used for some kind of political engagement or some kind of activist agenda that we are not sure what it is. Okay? So this is what I think.
Okay, so just a brief follow-up. I mean, I was just underlining, we agree, Kayvan, you and I, we obviously agree on quite a bit, but I think I said the exact opposite of what you said, right? Every text is active. That's an interesting to make there. But, and I would say as a follow-up to what you just said, if a text is, if say Bijan al-Lahi does not intend his text to be used in an activist way, but it is later used, well then doesn't the afterlife of the text along the lines of Walter Benjamin, isn't that also part of what a text is? What happens to it centuries later? So some differences there, but interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, there was another question that you've probably seen, so I'll just read it to you. What do you think is the most harmful outcome of the armchair analysis psychology approach of translational activism in the context of academia or within literary texts generally?
Rebecca?
Okay, so maybe you'll have thoughts after, but I'll just briefly think of what I would say to that. Well, first I would say I'm not sure. I mean, harmful is a really strong word. I think the first thing that I thought when I saw that question was, I think the most harmful thing is not to translate. There's often a kind of, well, okay, we could cite an example of this academic armchair analysis, perhaps Emily Apter's work on untranslatability, is it called Against Untranslatability? Kayvan, do you remember? Against world literature. Yeah, right. And so it's a kind of case, she makes a kind of case, one might, I mean, she probably wouldn't agree, but one might say that it's a kind of, the implication of that is don't translate. And I think that's probably the worst thing you could do. You know, there are bad translations, there's inadequate translations, there's, you know, translations always have problems, but I think to not do it at all, whether you're an academic or a non-academic, then you're really bringing it all to an end. So I think that can be done from within academic context or outside. But I think to kind of just to criticize translation as a failed enterprise without actually translating is probably, that's where I would see actual harm.
Yeah. For my part, I think that I tend to think about this danger of institutionalization of activist agendas. Okay, this is very important because not every activist intervention or any activist agenda is funded, for example. They are a lot of them are formed around volunteer work, so they need something to sustain themselves. This is very important because funding has to do with this institutionalization and with the stabilization. So as I told you during this presentation, a movement that starts with some kind of mobilization will end in some kind of institutionalization and conservatism. Okay, this is a real danger for academic analysis of activist movements, social movements, or the other thing is that perhaps they are being used as some kind of a data for power to consolidating itself. Okay, so this is very important because we are thinking it about, and we are thinking about it in a framework of academia as, for example, as a capitalist institution in itself. So it has to do with making money. So how to make money out of activism is not a very good question to ask. Okay, so that is why this is what I think about this danger.
Okay, I just want to very briefly respond to a couple of questions that you may have seen. Somebody was asking, how can we obtain the volume or access the volume on translation activism? I just want to let everybody know that AUC Library owns an e-book copy of the volume, and if you are within the AUC community, you can access the library and use that copy that we have, or if you have friends at AUC, they will probably be able to help you out as well, because as Rebecca said, it is a pretty expensive hard copy. Unfortunately, it's really unfortunate. The other question is that is asked is if you could recommend further readings on the theoretical framework of activism in translation. I think Rebecca has already provided several websites and what they do, what they're interested in, but I'm sure that you have a humongous, if you access the volume, there is a tremendous bibliography also attached to all of the chapters, and you will be able to sort of create a world really of translation activism just by browsing through these bibliographies of the various chapters in the volume.
I'll just brief addition to that. There's actually also, Kayvan and I created a website for that. We haven't added much yet, but we're adding resources, and I'll add this presentation, all the links and so forth. So you can also, I think just I won't give you the address because it's too long, but just if you Google translation and activism, it will come up, the website. And so that's easily available.
Okay.
Bibliographies.
Wonderful. Okay, do you have any other questions you wish to respond to from the array that we've got?
Oh, there's more coming. Oh no. I think that there's a lot, some of them are sort of the same questions.
Exactly, that's why I thought, we can pack them together. Well, okay, this has been really very enriching and very empowering, I must say. And it's been a delight really to host you both, and thank you for the magnificent work you've done. And I hope that everybody will go out there and take a look at this volume that I think is really, takes us in our endeavor within the classroom, even since I am teaching a seminar in translation studies. It also, changes the where we're going as instructors, but also for students to see that there are new territories out there that we need to explore and sort of brave and include, because it is vital and and crucial, as you have made it sound in your volume. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And
thanks everyone for listening.
Looking forward to the next volume.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. Yeah.
Goodbye.
Good night.